The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen fails at 3 in the afternoon on the 17th of March, 1945. No single blow brings it down. 10 days of aircraft bombing, direct artillery hits, near misses, and German demolition attempts have all loaded the same steel, and now it gives way, and the river opens beneath it. And by the time the span drops into the Rhine, more than 125,000 troops of 6 divisions have already crossed it to the east bank. The bridge has done its work. The men who were ordered to destroy it before any of that happened are not there to answer for it. 4 of them are already dead, executed by Hitler's flying court-martial for failing to destroy this exact bridge. The court did not wait for the bridge to fall. There were 4 bodies in the ground before the first steel hit the water. The span lets go, and the river takes it. And on the far bank, the Allied bridgehead keeps functioning, because the crossing stopped depending on the bridge days ago. So the question is how a state came to execute 4 men for failing to destroy a bridge that still stood while an army crossed it. The answer does not begin on the 17th of March. It begins weeks earlier, with a map reduced to a handful of lines. The last bridges still standing on the Rhine. Hitler's demolition orders have already gone out. The Ludendorff Bridge is supposed to be one of them. It is still there. By the first week of March 1945, the Western Allies run out of open country. Ahead of them is the Rhine, the last natural barrier between the advancing columns and the German interior. A river like that does not have to be thousands of meters wide to stop an army, but it has to be wide enough, deep enough, and fast enough to turn every crossing into an attack. By the 1st of March, the count along the Rhine is down from 22 road bridges and 25 railroad bridges to 4 spans still standing. A handful of steel points holding the door shut against the entire Allied advance. And the physical meaning of that number is harsher than the count. Every tank, every fuel truck, every infantry column on the West Bank needs one of those spans to get back across. Without a bridge, the river becomes a wall, and the army on the wrong side is just waiting to be rolled up against the water. So a retreating force that loses a crossing does not only lose a route, it loses the ability to move at all. On the 6th of March, the Germans destroy the Hohenzollern Bridge in Cologne themselves, and one of the 4 goes down into the river, and that leaves 3 crossing sites on the entire Rhine. The class of crossing matters too. A rail bridge carries trains, which means bulk supply, heavy guns, and ammunition moving on a fixed line. A road bridge carries trucks and troops. Drop one class, and every other route has to absorb the load. And when the count is already down to 3, there is no slack left anywhere in the system, which is what a demolition policy is designed to do. The defenders are not trying to win the river. They are trying to make it impossible to cross, and if the barrier is absolute, the enemy has to stop, build up, and pay in time. The river was already a barrier on its own, since engineers can bring bridging equipment up to the bank. What the dropped bridges buy is time. Every one of them costs the Allies hours, maybe days, and forces them to bring up more engineers, more boats, and more steel. Now, every unit, every vehicle, every ton of munitions has to funnel through a shrinking set of steel spans. The lines bunch up on the West Bank, and the crossing becomes the whole campaign. But the remaining bridges do not all sit in places where an Allied commander can simply ignore them. One of them sits on the American route, and that is the one that will matter. The next question is what it is connected to, and who is actually holding it. The force at Remagen is a handful of men scattered around a bridge, and most of them are not here to fight for it because their weapons, their training, and their bodies are all wrong for the job. Captain Willy Bracha has 36 men, and that number matters less than what it hides. These are not riflemen pulled from an active division. They are convalescing soldiers taken from hospital beds and aid stations rather than a training ground. And some of them cannot fire a weapon at all. So when you picture the last natural barrier on the Western Front, picture a hospital detail propped up on the wrong side of the Rhine. Backing them is an engineer company of 125 men under Captain Karl Friesenhahn. These are technical troops, the kind who know how to rig a bridge for destruction. They know the wiring, the charges, the weak points. But knowing how to blow a crossing is not the same as holding it against an infantry column. And Friesenhahn's men are not equipped for that second job. You can be an expert at collapse and still be useless in a firefight. Then come the teenagers. 180 Hitler-judged stand at the bridge boy soldiers, some of them barely old enough to carry a rifle. Motivated, maybe, But motivation is not a defensive plan, and it does not stop an infantry platoon, which is exactly the smallest thing that will come up that road. A Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit is on the rolls too, and its 200 men are listed for Remagen, but the guns are not in position. The battery exists on paper, and the sky above the bridge stays open. A rocket battery contributes 20 men. About 120 Eastern volunteers fill out the position, pulled together from different armies, different fronts, different reasons for being here. Put them all together and you get a loose collection of detachments, each with a different job, and none of them here to hold a river crossing. A hospital ward, a technical crew, a school formation, a flak battery out of position, a rocket detail, and a body of Eastern volunteers. That is what the Third Reich has left at Remagen, and it is not what you assemble when you expect to hold a river line for more than an afternoon. So who are these men supposed to stop? Not armored divisions, and not a coordinated assault. A reconnaissance patrol, maybe, for an afternoon, if everything goes right. The roll call has already answered whether they can hold the bridge. What is left is whether the bridge can be made to fall before they have to try, and that does not belong to them. It belongs to the wiring. The charges sit under the roadbed. If they go off, the crossing disappears. If they do not, these men are not enough to stop what is coming. For now, the defenders watch the sky and the far bank. Under their boots, the charges sit in place. The powder under the Ludendorff Bridge is donorite, a civilian mining explosive that belongs in a quarry face, not lashed to a bridge pier. Off-the-shelf material, the sort of blasting crew uses to peel back rock. Its job in civilian life is to fracture stone, not to cut the structural steel of a railroad bridge. So the men at Remagen are working with a thin margin before anyone reaches for a switch. And before anyone does, shellfire has already worked over the firing line running from the firing point to the bridge. The impulse never reaches the packs, and the accounts that survive put the break in that electrical path. So a corporal goes out into the open and lights the manual fuse by hand because what he lights is the backup and the primary path is dead. One man on the bridge, under fire, with a length of fuse that was never meant to be the main event. The plan has shrunk to one pair of hands. Only one of the pier packs goes off. The bridge heaves, rises inches, then drops back onto its bearings. A span that size should fold into the Rhine. It stays up. Why does a bridge built for rail traffic survive a direct burst? Part of the answer sits in the paperwork, and the paperwork does not agree with itself. Some files assign a request for 600 kilograms to Remagen. Others describe two 300-kilogram packs on girders linked to the East Pier, rather than all of the weight placed on the southeastern pier by Friesenhahn. The files do not say which layout was actually built. And the disagreement matters, because a bridge is a long steel line, and the same quantity of powder does not behave the same way when its location changes. It is the difference between a charge placed to drop a span and a charge placed close enough to shake it. None of these failures stands alone. A half-severed firing line, a civilian powder, and a manual fuse that reaches only part of the installation. You cannot point at one of them and say there it is. The backup was never a second complete firing path, and the whole preparation was ragged from the start. The physical outcome is not contested. The powder that was supposed to sever steel barely clears the support. The structure absorbs the shock and remains standing. The river keeps moving, and the bridge stays intact. And the officer who will have to answer for that bridge is Major Scheller. It is the morning of the 7th of March, and the Ludendorff Bridge is somehow still standing when Major Scheller reaches Remagen, with no radio and not a single fresh company behind him. That absence matters more than the bridge itself, because the man who is supposed to decide the span's fate cannot call higher command and cannot pull reinforcements from anywhere. Captain Bridge has already reached the harder conclusion. He has watched the German retreat pour east across the bridge all morning, and he knows what is pushing up the road from the west. He wants the span down, but Scheller does not give the order to fire the charges. The crossing is still full of German soldiers, and closing it now would strand every one of them on the wrong side of the Rhine. They are not a formed unit, they are the remnants of a retreat, and they are still coming. So he delays. Then a vehicle moves through that retreat carrying 5 men and a machine gun, which makes it the single piece of mobile firepower that might give Scheller a real hand on the approaches. He steps into the road and tries to flag it down. The driver does not slow. He accelerates across the bridge, and the 5 men and the gun go east with him. There is no radio to report the loss, no reserve to replace it, and no way to stop the next vehicle if that driver decides to ignore him too. Scheller marks it and keeps watching the road. The span is still open, the retreat is still using it, and the American advance is no longer a rumor beyond the trees. The approaches are not a defensive line. They are a single road with a few tired men scattered along it. So he concludes the bridge cannot be defended, which is a plain read of an officer handed a bridge to blow without the ground to hold it. Brages still wants the span down. Scheller still delays. The gap between the last German soldier and the first American unit is no longer measured in hours, and the last of those soldiers are on the crossing, where firing the charges would catch them. One officer holds the authority and cannot talk to anyone. The other has the will and no authority to release the charges. Between them, the bridge stays open, and the command system that put them there does not send a runner, a radio set, or a single fresh squad. And there is no time left to spend, because the road to the west is no longer a rear area, and the force that is about to arrive can see the towers. On the American side of the Rhine, the men who will test Scheller's conclusion are already moving toward the crossing. Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, 9th Armored Division, comes off the high ground on the 7th of March, moving down toward the river with the span still up in front of them. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman is the man out front, and he does not halt at the water. The German charges are still wired into the frame. Behind him, the column waits, armor engines sending a low shiver through the road. The fire from the far bank is heavy enough to make the edge of the water feel like a wall, but the wall has a door in it, and the door is the bridge. The charges are not going to wait for him, and Timmerman, an infantry officer rather than an engineer, is the one who bends to the steel and starts cutting at the wire. The NBC correspondent Everett Hollis reports what he sees: a lieutenant cutting wire after wire while the rounds come in from the far side, then kicking the German charges off the bridge with his feet under heavy machine gun fire. The next charge goes the same way, and the next, each one dropping into the Rhine and gone. The deck under him is a lattice of iron and ties, and the men feel the river through every step. They carry rifles and not much else. The bridge is wide enough for a vehicle, but not wide enough for caution, and Timmerman does not look back. The company does not stop to help him, because the only way to clear that bridge is to cross it. They come onto the span behind him in loose order, without waiting for the deck to be clean. They cross at a run, and they do not bunch up, because a machine gun does not need them to bunch up. It only needs them to slow down, which is exactly what they refuse to do. Some men go down, and the company does not stop over them. The fire from the east side is aimed at the bridge mouth, and once the first few men are through that threshold, they pour into the shadow on the far side and keep going. The east bank becomes American ground by moving through the first positions, rather than by clearing every one of them. For Timmerman and Company A, the figure that will matter is about 4 minutes, west side to a foothold on the east. A crossing like this is normally a matter of pontoons and boats, and this one is already over. The first vehicles roll onto the bridge behind the infantry, and the span takes their weight. They cross in daylight, under fire, and they keep coming, because the bridge has stopped being a trap and started being a road. By the end of that daylight, the east bank is secure, and the first trucks and armor follow the infantry across. And in Berlin, the report goes up the chain to a man for whom failure is a personal problem. What reaches him is not a story about a bridge that fell. It is a report about a bridge that did not. The report reaches Berlin on the 8th of March. Hitler does not ask for an analysis of the ground. He asks for a court. The man he selects is on the Eastern Front, and his name is Rudolf Hübner. Hübner has spent the war in the field, not in a courtroom. He is not a lawyer, and he has never run a military tribunal. What he is handed is a grant of power over whoever crosses his path. And that is the first violation, built into the job itself. The German military code lays out who may preside over such a court. A judge sits on the bench, separate from the man who brings the accusation. A prosecutor makes the case. The accused faces both, and the rules exist to keep those two voices apart. At Remagen, the same man is prosecutor and judge, and no legal experience is required of him. And the code is not an abstraction here. A copy of it is in the same room, and Hübner waves it aside. He does not consult the relevant sections. He does not check whether the assignment matches the rules. The only permission he needs, he insists, is Hitler's. The company he keeps says the rest. With Hübner are Lieutenant Colonel Anton Ernst Berger and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Penth. They are not legal advisors, and they are not there to read rights or process appeals. They are there to manage the procedure. Behind them stand two military police, who are not clerks. They are the execution squad. So the entire court is one legally untrained general, two staff officers, and two policemen. The paperwork is thin. There is no defense advocate in the party and no appeals officer, and the arrangement is built that way from the first day. The two military police do not need to know the law. They need to know how to load and aim. A proper court would ask questions, hold hearings, and produce a record. Berlin wants speed. This arrangement only receives names, and the first names arrive before any hearing opens. The records do not begin with evidence. They begin with targets, officers who were near the river when the order to bring the structure down was given, and their names reach the court through the same machinery that reports failure upward. The code is still sitting there, unopened. The rules say a man like Hübner cannot sit on that bench, and rules like that hold only as long as the government behind them is willing to enforce them. Berlin has already decided it will not. So what is missing from that room is not postponed. It is deleted. A tribunal under German military rules exists to test evidence, to keep the accusation separate from the verdict, and to give the accused a defensible process. None of those functions are present here. What is left is a list of names and enough armed men to finish the job, which means the trial is over before it starts, and the only work remaining is the reading of names. The squad has not yet carried out a single sentence, but the bench is built from one man's will, and the structure is already armed. So the first two names come off the pile, and the men attached to them are not given a chance to speak. Scheller and Peters are read a sentence, taken outside by the escort, and executed with a single shot to the back of the neck. The bodies go into a pit, scraped in the dirt under a few shovelfuls of earth. Bragg is not in that pit for one concrete reason. The Americans already have him, and not every name is handled at the same speed. The case file for Major Herbert Strobel and Major August Kraft arrives on the 17th of March, and Hübner grants their hearing 20 minutes. In that window, someone opens a file and skims a record. No one speaks for them, no one appeals, and no second set of eyes looks at the file. Hübner finds them both guilty. The accused never get to challenge the facts, and Hübner never has to build a case, because the end point is already produced. The papers go back into the folder, and the order sends the squad to a wooded site at 1 in the afternoon on the 17th of March. Strobel and Kraft are walked there, and the sentence is carried out. Then come the smaller jobs. The family letters are torn up. The bodies are left under a few shovelfuls of dirt. The words that mattered to someone go into the ground as paper scraps. The proceeding does not buy a military gain or a restored front. It produces a stack of signed forms, 2 shallow mounds in the trees, and 1 sentence with no execution attached to it, because the paper that lists Bratsch among the guilty is typed up while he sits in American hands where no firing squad can reach him. The dirt over the graves is still loose when the bridge comes down at 3 in the afternoon, 2 hours after the shots. And by then, the German staff is reaching for a piece of paper to send to every unit. The signal goes out on the 18th of March. Kesselring and Model put their names to it, and it reaches every German military unit. The wording describes the executions in plain terms. 4 officers shot for failing to destroy a Rhine crossing at Remagen, and a 5th alive only because he was already a prisoner in American hands. Nothing in the signal calls this a failure of planning or a consequence of a weak garrison. The lesson is individual and personal. But that message does not restore discipline. It teaches a different rule. An officer who watches a nearby command get punished has an obvious reason not to hold a river crossing open for a fighting withdrawal. He blows it early, before the last of his columns are across, because the charge can always be justified later. Why hold a crossing for a retreat that may never come, when the high command has already announced, by example and by dispatch, that losing one is enough to get an officer shot? So what follows is the reverse of what Berlin wanted. German officers spend disproportionate time and explosives blowing crossings even when it makes no tactical sense, and that habit cripples the German war effort far behind the front. Columns use up charges on crossings they still need, because every intact crossing looks like a potential charge against a commander, and the retreat gets slower, more fractured, and more expensive in the same week. And none of this is hidden from the field. The dispatch names the penalty and leaves the choice to the reader. No direct order is required. The dispatch is the order. Meanwhile, the thing all of it was supposed to prevent has already happened. The Allied foothold at Remagen is secure and growing by the day, and no one has to force a crossing there, because the far bank is already held in strength. The timetable for forcing the Rhine elsewhere moves forward by 3 weeks. That is, 3 extra weeks of pontoon trains, fuel drums, ammunition crates, and replacement infantry stockpiled on the west bank before the next assault. While the German officer spends charges on his own rear area, Allied transport columns are moving the other way, carrying the material that makes that assault possible. A command that shoots its own officers for losing a crossing has not secured the river line. It has taught every survivor to treat every remaining crossing as a casualty, to be paid in advance. The yield of the 18th of March is a German retreat doing more damage to itself on the river line than Allied spearheads could manage alone.